Hi.
I met Lena during one of those rare moments in life when everything feels perfectly aligned. It was summer, the kind where the days stretch out endlessly, and the nights are warm and electric. A mutual friend had invited me to a low-key party on the outskirts of town. A bonfire, beers and coolers, and the kind of relaxed atmosphere where time doesn't really matter. I hadn't wanted to go at first. I'd been nursing a bad breakup for months, keeping mostly to myself, avoiding anything resembling social interaction. But that night, for reasons I couldn't explain, I agreed. It was a decision that would alter the course of my life. Lena was sitting on a log near the fire, her laughter carrying through the air like music. She wasn't the loudest or flashiest person at the party, but there was something magnetic about her. She had a way of pulling people in without even trying. I remember watching her from a distance, feeling inexplicably drawn to her. When our friend introduced us, her smile hit me like a punch to the chest. She had these green eyes that seemed to see straight through me, and the kind of confidence that didn't need to be spoken. From that night on, Lena was a part of my world. We started with the usual late-night texts, inside jokes, and hours spent learning every little thing about each other. She worked as an events coordinator, someone always on the move, planning parties and fundraisers for local businesses. She was smart, ambitious, and fun in a way that I hadn't experienced in years. With Lena, life felt lighter. She had a way of making even the most mundane things, like grocery shopping or sitting in traffic, seem like an adventure. It didn't take long for me to fall head over heels. Our relationship moved quickly but naturally. Within months, we were spending most nights together at her apartment or mine. We traveled, attended friends' weddings, and spent weekends binge-watching bad reality TV. For the first time in a long time, I felt genuinely happy. Lena had a way of pulling me out of my own head, dragging me into the present moment whether I liked it or not. Her spontaneity balanced out my more reserved nature, and people often commented on how good we were for each other. I believed them. 2 years into our relationship, I proposed. It wasn't anything extravagant. Just the two of us, sitting by the lake where we'd gone on our first date. Lena cried and said yes, and in that moment, it felt like everything I'd ever wanted was finally within reach. I imagined our future together, a little house, maybe a dog, kids running through the backyard. I could see it so clearly, and it filled me with a warmth I hadn't realized I was missing. The months after the proposal were a whirlwind. Wedding planning became the center of our lives. Lena threw herself into it with the same energy and determination she brought to her work. She had spreadsheets, Pinterest boards, and a dozen different vendors on speed dial. I tried to help where I could, but most of the decisions were hers. She wanted everything to be perfect, the dress, the flowers, the venue. I didn't mind. Seeing her excited made me happy, and I trusted her to handle it. First, everything seemed fine. We went to cake tastings, toured venues, and argued playfully over music playlists. Lena's enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself getting caught up in it, imagining how beautiful she'd look walking down the aisle. But as the weeks turned into months, I started to notice small changes. They were subtle at first, easy to brush off. She began staying later at work, often coming home exhausted and distracted. When I asked if everything was okay, she'd smile and tell me she was just stressed from planning the wedding and managing her workload. I believed her because I had no reason not to. Then there were the phone calls. Lena had always been someone who kept her phone close. It was practically an extension of her hand. But now, she seemed almost paranoid about it. If I walked into a room while she was texting, she'd quickly lock the screen and put the phone face down. I told myself I was imagining things. Lena had never given me a reason to doubt her, and I wasn't the kind of person who snooped through someone else's messages. Still, the unease lingered, like a splinter I couldn't quite reach. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to wedding stress and my own paranoia. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I started noticing other things, too. She canceled plans with me more frequently, claiming she had meetings or errands to run. Sometimes, she'd disappear for hours without explanation, only to return with vague excuses that didn't quite add up. I wanted to trust her, to believe that everything was fine, but the distance between us was growing, and I didn't know how to bridge it. The breaking point came on a rainy Saturday afternoon. Lena had been gone since early morning, saying she had a meeting with a florist about some last-minute changes. Hours passed, and when I texted to ask if she was okay, her replies were curt and evasive. I spent the rest of the day pacing the house, feeling like a man waiting for a bomb to go off. When she finally came home that evening, she seemed off. Her hair was damp, her clothes slightly rumpled, and she wouldn't look me in the eye. I asked her about the florist, and she mumbled something about traffic and how it had taken longer than expected. She kissed me on the cheek and disappeared upstairs before I could ask anything else. That night, I lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling as her breathing slowed into the rhythm of sleep. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Where had she really been? Who had she been with? The doubt that I'd been trying so hard to ignore was now a roar in my ears, impossible to silence. I knew then that something was wrong, something much bigger than wedding stress or work fatigue. I just didn't know what it was. The next day, I decided to confide in my best friend, Matt. Matt and I had been friends since college, and he'd always been the one person I could count on to give it to me straight. I told him about Lena's behavior, the late nights, the phone calls, the growing distance between us. He listened quietly, his expression unreadable, before telling me that I needed to trust my instincts. If something felt wrong, it probably was. He suggested I keep an eye on things, just to put my mind at ease. I didn't like the idea of spying on Lena, but deep down I knew he was right. The nagging feeling in my gut wasn't going to go away on its own. Over the next few weeks, I paid closer attention to Lena's actions. I noted the times she left the house and when she returned. I paid attention to the way she spoke, the way she avoided my gaze when I asked questions. I even checked our shared bank account for any unusual transactions, but everything seemed normal. For a while, I started to wonder if I was overreacting, if I was just another paranoid guy letting his insecurities get the better of him. But then I found the receipt. It was crumpled up in the bottom of her work bag, half hidden beneath a pile of old papers. The name of a hotel was printed across the top, along with a date from the previous week. My heart sank as I stared at it, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. I wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation, but deep down I already knew the truth. Lena had been lying to me. The question now was, why? In that moment, everything I thought I knew about my relationship came crashing down. The woman I loved, the woman I was planning to marry, was hiding something from me. Something big. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to find out the truth, no matter how much it hurt. After finding the hotel receipt, everything I thought I knew about Lena began to crumble. I couldn't look at her the same way anymore, couldn't silence the voice in my head that kept whispering the questions I was too afraid to ask. I hid the receipt in my drawer, as though keeping it out of sight would somehow dull its weight. But it didn't. If anything, it grew heavier with each passing day, a constant reminder of the cracks spreading through the foundation of our relationship. The unease started eating at me. Lena's phone became a constant presence in her hand, and she seemed almost paranoid about it. Whenever I walked into the room, she'd quickly lock the screen and place it face down on the table. If I asked what she was doing, her answers were vague, something about work emails or texts from her mom. But the feeling of being lied to began to intensify. Late-night outings became more frequent, always accompanied by some excuse about work-related commitments or last-minute errands. Each one chipped away at the trust I'd always thought was unshakable. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself I was overthinking things. Lena had never given me a reason to doubt her before, and the last thing I wanted was to become some paranoid partner who jumped to conclusions. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize her behavior, that gnawing feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I decided to confide in Matt. He'd always been my sounding board, the realist who could talk me off the ledge when I started spiraling. We met for drinks one evening, and I laid everything out for him. The late nights, the phone secrecy, the growing distance between Lena and me. Matt listened intently, his brow furrowed as he processed what I was saying. He advised me to keep a close eye on things but not to act impulsively, suggesting that gathering evidence before making accusations would be the wisest approach. His advice made sense, but it didn't make the waiting any easier. Over the next week, I became hyper-aware of Lena's actions. I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way she'd glance at her phone and smile faintly, as if reading something meant for her eyes only. The way she'd step outside to take calls she claimed were work-related. Her voice hushed and hurried. The excuses for why she couldn't join me for dinner or why she was suddenly too tired to talk at the end of the day. Each moment felt like another piece of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. Then I found it. The receipt. It was stuffed carelessly in the bottom of her work bag, buried beneath a pile of old papers and receipts for coffee shops and groceries. This one was different, though. The name of a hotel was printed across the top, along with a date from the previous week. My heart sank as I stared at it, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. I wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation, but deep down I already knew the truth. Lena had been lying to me. The question now was, why? I didn't confront her. Not yet. I wasn't ready for the conversation that would follow. Wasn't ready to hear whatever excuses she'd come up with to explain away the unexplainable. Instead, I decided to investigate further. If there was more to this, I needed to know. I started keeping track of her schedule, noting when she left the house and when she returned. I checked our shared bank account for unusual transactions, cross-referencing them with her explanations for where she'd been. Most of it was mundane, the kind of ordinary details that might have gone unnoticed if not for the larger context. But there were discrepancies. Charges at restaurants I'd never heard of. Unexplained gaps in her schedule that didn't align with what she told me. Each one added another layer of doubt, another piece to the growing puzzle. I couldn't stop replaying Matt's advice in my head. He had told me to be patient, to gather as much evidence as I could before making any accusations. It was good advice, but it didn't make the waiting any easier. The tension in our home became almost unbearable. Lena still smiled at me, still kissed me on the cheek before leaving for work, but it all felt hollow now. Her touches lacked warmth. Her laughter seemed forced. I wondered how long she'd been pretending, how many moments of our relationship had been a lie. The breaking point came on a Friday evening. Lena had told me she was meeting a friend for dinner, but something about the way she said it felt off. Her voice was too casual, her smile too practiced. I decided to follow her. I waited until she left, then grabbed my keys and trailed her car from a distance. She drove across town, eventually pulling into the parking lot of the same hotel listed on the receipt I'd found. I parked a few spaces away and watched as she got out of the car, her phone pressed to her ear. She was dressed nicer than usual, her hair styled in a way that suggested she'd put more effort into her appearance than she normally would for dinner with a friend. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the walls of the car were closing in around me. After a few minutes, a man approached her. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a confident gait. They exchanged a brief hug before walking into the hotel together. My stomach dropped. I wanted to storm in after them, to demand answers, but I couldn't move. I sat there, paralyzed by a cocktail of rage, heartbreak, and disbelief. This was it. The confirmation I'd been dreading. I stayed in the car for what felt like hours, replaying the scene over and over in my mind. Eventually, I drove home, my thoughts a tangled mess of anger and despair. By the time Lena returned later that night, I had already made up my mind. I wasn't going to confront her, not yet. I needed more. More evidence, more clarity, more time to figure out how to handle this without letting my emotions get the better of me. Over the next few days, I threw myself into gathering every piece of information I could. I went through her emails, her social media accounts, even her laptop. The more I found, the clearer the picture became. She wasn't just hiding something. She was leading a double life, one that I had been completely blind to. And the more I uncovered, the more I realized that the betrayal went deeper than I could have ever imagined. The days following my discovery became an intricate dance of pretending. I lived under the same roof as Lena, shared meals, and exchanged pleasantries, all while knowing that her words and actions were nothing more than a facade. The weight of what I had seen at the hotel and the implications of her secret life pressed down on me like a storm cloud, relentless and suffocating. I hadn't confronted her yet, But the time was coming, and I needed to be ready. I began assembling the pieces of her betrayal with the precision of a detective solving a case. Every detail mattered. I went back through her text messages, scrolling through the cryptic conversations with her unnamed contact. The shorthand and coded language were maddening, but patterns began to emerge. Certain phrases reappeared, mentions of meetings, plans, and references to places that didn't align with her explanations to me. These weren't random words. They were part of a carefully constructed lie. Lena's emails offered more clarity. I logged into her account using a password I'd guessed based on her usual combinations of dates and names. Most of the messages were innocuous: work correspondence, confirmations for wedding vendors, and the occasional newsletter. But hidden in a folder marked personal, I found exchanges that made my stomach churn. There were emails to and from the man I had seen at the hotel. He had a name now, Eric. Their exchanges were more formal than I expected, lacking the intimacy I'd imagined. At first glance, they seemed like business discussions, references to contracts and schedules. But as I read deeper, the veil lifted. They weren't discussing work. They were coordinating their meetups, using professional language as a cover. The specificity of the details, dates, times, and locations, left no room for doubt. I saved everything, screenshots and downloaded copies, building a folder of evidence that grew with each passing day. Despite everything I had uncovered, I couldn't escape the feeling that there was more to the story. Lena's behavior didn't just scream infidelity. It hinted at something larger, something more calculated. The details didn't add up in the way I expected them to. If she was simply having an affair, why go to such lengths to cover it up with such precision? Why not just lie about late nights at work or visiting friends? The complexity of her deceit suggested a deeper motive, and I couldn't rest until I knew what it was. I decided to expand my search. I reached out to a few of Lena's friends, casually probing for details about her recent activities. Most of them seemed genuinely unaware of anything out of the ordinary. They spoke about the wedding with excitement, asking if I was ready for the big day and commenting on how busy Lena must be with the planning. It struck me how well she had played her role, maintaining the appearance of a devoted fiancée even as she led a double life. But one conversation stood out. I ran into her sister, Alyssa, at a coffee shop. Alyssa had always been close with Lena, but there was an edge to her that I had never fully understood. She seemed guarded, her smiles never quite reaching her eyes. Over lattes, I mentioned how hard Lena had been working and how impressed I was by her dedication to making the wedding perfect. Alyssa hesitated before responding, her expression flickering with something I couldn't place. She said Lena had always been meticulous, but then added, almost as an afterthought, that Lena's priorities had shifted in recent months. When I pressed for clarification, she deflected, saying she didn't want to get involved in our personal matters. Her words stayed with me. Alyssa knew something, but whether she was protecting Lena or trying to protect me, I couldn't tell. I filed the interaction away, another piece of a puzzle that was quickly becoming overwhelming. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about betrayal. It was about control, manipulation, and a plan that I still couldn't fully see. Determined to get answers, I decided to follow Lena again. She had another meeting scheduled for the evening, and I waited until she left before trailing her car. This time, she didn't go to the hotel. Instead, she drove to an upscale restaurant on the other side of town. I parked a safe distance away and watched as she walked inside. Moments later, Eric arrived. They were seated at a table near the window, their expressions composed but their body language far too familiar for comfort. I watched them through the glass, my heart pounding with a mix of rage and despair. They spoke in low tones, leaning toward each other as though sharing secrets. At one point, Lena pulled out her phone and showed Eric something on the screen. He nodded, his expression serious. They weren't laughing or flirting. Their interaction was methodical, almost clinical. It wasn't the behavior of two people caught up in a whirlwind romance. It was the behavior of co-conspirators. As they left the restaurant, I followed them again. This time, they went to an office building downtown. It was late, and most of the surrounding businesses were closed, But Lena and Eric entered with ease, swiping a keycard at the entrance. I waited outside for nearly 2 hours before they reemerged. Their expressions were neutral, their movements unhurried. Whatever they were doing inside, it wasn't spontaneous. It was planned. I returned home that night with more questions than answers. Lena's affair with Eric was undeniable, but their interactions suggested something far more orchestrated than I had imagined. The meticulous planning, the secrecy, the use of professional spaces for their meetings, it all pointed to a scheme that went beyond infidelity. And the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't just dealing with a betrayal of the heart. I was dealing with a betrayal of trust, loyalty, and perhaps even legality. The following morning, I decided to confront Matt. He had been my confidant throughout this ordeal, and I needed his perspective on what I had discovered. When I laid out the new evidence, his reaction was measured but concerned. He urged me to tread carefully, to consider the possibility that confronting Lena too soon could backfire. If there was a larger plan at play, she might take drastic measures to protect it. Matt's words stuck with me as I spent the next few days piecing together the timeline of Lena's actions. I cross-referenced the hotel receipts, the restaurant charges, and her phone records, building a clearer picture of her double life. It was meticulous work, exhausting and emotionally draining, but it gave me a sense of control in a situation where I had none. By the end of the week, I had enough evidence to confirm my suspicions. Lena and Eric weren't just having an affair. They were planning something far more elaborate. The details were still hazy, but the pieces were falling into place. Whatever their endgame was, it involved deception on a scale I hadn't thought possible. And as I stared at the mountain of evidence before me, one thought burned brighter than all the others. I had to stop them, no matter what it took. The revelations of the past weeks left me feeling like a stranger in my own life. The woman I had planned to marry, the one I had imagined building a future with, was part of a scheme so elaborate that it felt surreal. Each piece of evidence I uncovered only deepened the mystery and made the betrayal cut sharper. But I couldn't let the emotional weight of it consume me. I needed to stay focused, to figure out what Lena and Eric's endgame was, and to ensure that I wasn't left as collateral damage. I spent my days gathering every shred of information I could find, my nights consumed with piecing it all together. I revisited the emails between Lena and Eric, examining every line for hidden meanings or clues. Their coded language was becoming more familiar to me, and patterns began to emerge. Words like assets, splits, and delivery appeared repeatedly, and I realized they weren't just discussing their meetups. They were planning something transactional. As I delved deeper, I stumbled across another layer of deception. Lena had opened a separate bank account, one that she had never mentioned to me. The account had been active for months, with significant deposits and withdrawals that didn't align with her salary or our shared expenses. The transactions included payments to unknown vendors and transfers to an account under Eric's name. It was clear that they were pooling resources, but for what purpose I still couldn't determine. One evening, I sat in the dim light of my office, poring over the data I had collected. It felt like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces, each discovery only raising more questions. My mind wandered to the life Lena and I had shared, the moments that now felt tainted by her lies. Every laugh, every embrace, every whispered promise. Had any of it been real? The thought was unbearable, but I forced myself to push it aside. Emotions could wait. For now, I needed answers. A breakthrough came when I decided to retrace Lena's steps from months earlier. I accessed her social media accounts, looking for posts, check-ins, or photos that might provide insight into her activities. Most of her posts were benign, pictures of our outings, updates about wedding planning, and the occasional motivational quote. But buried in her tagged photos, I found an image that sent a chill down my spine. It was from a charity gala she had attended without me, claiming it was a work obligation. In the background of the photo, barely noticeable, was Eric. He was speaking to another man, one I didn't recognize, but the intensity of their exchange was unmistakable. This wasn't a chance encounter. It was part of something much larger. I decided to dig into Eric's background. Using his full name, which I had gleaned from their emails, I conducted a deep search. What I found was both illuminating and terrifying. Eric was a financial consultant with a history of involvement in questionable ventures. His name appeared in several lawsuits related to fraud and embezzlement, though he had managed to evade any serious consequences. It became clear that he wasn't just Lena's lover. He was her partner in crime. The pieces were beginning to fit together. The secret bank accounts, the coded emails, the carefully orchestrated meetings. Lena and Eric were planning a scam. But the question remained, who was the target? First, I assumed it was me. After all, I had poured my savings into our wedding, trusting Lena to handle the details. But the scale of their operation suggested something much larger. They weren't just after my money. They were playing a high-stakes game, and I was just a pawn in their scheme. As I continued my investigation, I realized I couldn't do this alone. I needed help, someone who could provide a fresh perspective and support me as I navigated this labyrinth of deceit. I turned to Alyssa, Lena's sister. Despite her reluctance during our previous conversation, I sensed that she knew more than she had let on. I reached out to her, framing it as a request for advice about the wedding. She agreed to meet, and we arranged to talk at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. When I arrived, Alyssa was already waiting, her expression guarded. Over coffee, I carefully steered the conversation toward Lena's recent behavior. Initially, Alyssa seemed hesitant, claiming she didn't want to interfere in our relationship. As I revealed the evidence I had gathered, the hotel receipts, the bank statements, the emails, her demeanor shifted. She admitted to noticing changes in Lena, describing how her sister had become secretive and distant in recent months. Alyssa eventually mentioned an argument she'd had with Lena weeks earlier, during which Eric's name had come up. Lena had downplayed the significance, but Alyssa had always suspected there was more to the story. Alyssa's confirmation solidified what I already knew. Lena and Eric's connection was undeniable, and their plans were accelerating. I asked Alyssa for help in uncovering the truth, and though hesitant at first, she agreed. Together, we devised a plan to monitor Lena's movements more closely, using Alyssa's familiarity with her sister's routines to anticipate her next steps. The following week was a whirlwind of surveillance and discovery. With Alyssa's help, I managed to access Lena's work calendar, which revealed a series of meetings and events that didn't align with her explanations to me. One entry stood out: a conference scheduled at a luxury hotel downtown. It was listed as a networking event, but the timing and location raised red flags. I decided to investigate. On the evening of the conference, I arrived at the hotel dressed in a suit, blending in with the crowd of professionals mingling in the lobby. Lena was easy to spot. She stood near the bar, speaking animatedly with Eric and another man I didn't recognize. Their body language was casual but deliberate, their movements too synchronized to be spontaneous. I kept my distance, careful not to draw attention to myself. As the evening progressed, I observed Lena and Eric meeting with several individuals, exchanging briefcases and documents. It was a carefully choreographed performance, each interaction lasting only a few minutes before they moved on to the next target. It became clear that this wasn't just a scam. It was a con of significant scale, involving multiple parties and substantial sums of money. I left the hotel that night with a mix of clarity and dread. Lena and Eric were con artists, and their operation was far more elaborate than I had imagined. They were using their charm and professional personas to manipulate unsuspecting victims, exploiting their trust for financial gain. And while I still didn't know the full extent of their plan, one thing was certain: I couldn't let it continue. Armed with this new information, I began formulating a plan of my own. Confronting Lena directly was no longer an option. She had proven herself to be a master manipulator, and any confrontation would likely end in more lies and misdirection. Instead, I decided to gather irrefutable evidence of her and Eric's crimes, something that would expose them completely and ensure they faced the consequences of their actions. The first step was enlisting the help of a private investigator. I provided him with everything I had collected so far, from the emails and bank statements to the photos and observations from the conference. He assured me that his team would dig deeper, uncovering the details I couldn't access on my own. It was a small comfort, knowing that I wasn't alone in this fight. As I waited for the investigator's report, I prepared myself for the inevitable confrontation. The thought of facing Lena, of watching her facade crumble under the weight of her lies, filled me with a mixture of dread and anticipation. I didn't know how she would react, but one thing was certain. The truth was coming, and there was no escaping it. The days leading up to the confrontation were filled with preparation and nervousness. The private investigator's report arrived, and it was worse than I had imagined. Lena and Eric's scheme was big, involving fake investments, fake contracts, and tricking many people. The report included bank records, emails, and even video proof of their meetings. It was solid evidence that could not only ruin their plans but might also send them to jail. With this evidence, I made a plan to expose Lena and Eric in a way that left no doubt. Talking to Lena alone wasn't enough. She had lied so well for so long that I didn't trust her to admit anything. It needed to be public, clear, and final. The wedding gave me the perfect chance. It was risky, but it felt right to use the event she had planned as part of her scam against her. The morning of the wedding felt strange. Friends and family were busy around the venue, happy and excited, not knowing what was about to happen. The garden where the ceremony would take place was beautiful, decorated with flowers and rows of chairs. Guests arrived, dressed nicely and laughing, unaware of the truth. I walked among them, acting calm and normal, even though my mind was racing. Lena was in the bridal suite, getting ready. She had been cheerful the past few days, clearly thinking her plan was working perfectly. The thought made me angry, but I stayed calm. This wasn't the time for emotions. Soon everyone would know the truth. The ceremony began, and I stood at the altar waiting for Lena. The guests became quiet as music played, and Lena appeared, walking down the aisle in her wedding dress. She looked perfect, almost making me forget everything for a moment. But then I reminded myself of the lies and betrayal, and my resolve returned. The officiant started the ceremony, speaking about love and commitment. I barely heard the words. My thoughts focused on what I was about to do. When it was my turn to speak, I took a deep breath and turned to face the guests. Instead of saying my vows, I began explaining the truth. I told the guests that Lena was not who they thought she was. I shared the evidence I had gathered, explaining how she and Eric had been running a scam. I described the fake investments, the lies, and how they had been using people's trust to steal money. Gasps and whispers filled the crowd as I spoke, the shock spreading among them. I showed copies of the investigator's report, handing them to key people in the audience. Lena's parents, close friends, and even some wedding vendors who had unknowingly been part of her scam. The proof was undeniable, and the room grew tense as everyone began to understand the truth. As I continued, Lena's face changed from confusion to anger. She tried to interrupt, but the weight of the evidence silenced her. Then I revealed the final piece. I had contacted the police, and officers were waiting outside to arrest Lena and Eric. Right on time, the doors opened, and 2 officers walked in. The room erupted into chaos as they approached Lena, placing her under arrest. Eric, who had been hiding in the back, tried to escape but was quickly caught. After that, everything felt like a blur. The guests were shocked and upset, some comforting Lena's parents, others talking quietly in disbelief. I felt both relief and sadness. The woman I had loved, and the future I had imagined with her, was gone. But so was the burden of her lies. For the first time in months, I felt free. In the days after the wedding, the news spread quickly. Lena and Eric's crimes became public knowledge, and more victims came forward, adding to the case against them. The legal consequences were severe. For me, the experience was a mix of closure and pain. Telling the truth had freed me, but it also left me to deal with the emotional wreckage of what could have been. I needed time to recover, so I took a break from work and socializing. The house, once filled with memories of Lena, now felt empty. I packed up her belongings and got rid of them, trying to reclaim my space and my peace of mind. It was hard, but it was a step I needed to take. I started going to therapy, which helped me process the betrayal and my feelings. Talking about it gave me clarity and strength. My therapist encouraged me to focus on small steps, to find happiness in little things, and to rediscover the parts of myself I had lost during the chaos. Slowly, I began to heal. One day, while walking in the park near my house, I thought about everything that had happened. The pain of Lena's betrayal was still there, but it no longer controlled me. I realized that I had grown stronger, more aware of myself, and more determined to build a better life. The future felt uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it also felt full of possibilities. This experience taught me that love, when real, is a gift, but when it is used as a tool for lies, it can be devastating. Lena had used love to manipulate me, but by exposing her, I had taken back control. I decided to move forward with an open heart, wiser and more resilient. As I walked through the park, the sun breaking through the clouds, I felt a small spark of hope. One day, I believed, I would find love again, this time built on honesty and trust.
How was the video? Don't forget to leave your comment, like and subscribe. See you soon. Bye.